I'm your host, David Michalek. Along with me is America's #1 credit expert, John Ulzheimer, formerly with FICO and Equifax. John, welcome.
David, thank you for having me. I always look forward
No,
to my Credit Versio Wednesday events with you.
the fastest 50 minutes on the web. I was
Oh
by
yeah,
myself.
we're actually almost done.
Yeah, it's funny. Last week, I was on by myself, and I'm like, I'll just cover a couple of topics that I was really kind of short what I wanted to talk about. I'm like, I got one or two topics. We'll see where it goes, and then normally I'm really well prepared, and I got a whole bunch of stuff on the docket to talk about. I'm like, no, I'm just going to see where things go today, and I threw one or two topics out there, and the next thing I knew, it was 50. I was 57 minutes into it. I forgot how long it was. I remember looking down at the clock, going, "Oh man, this has gone on a lot longer than what I thought it was going to go." So, and that's just going into it without really, and that's one of the reasons why I only have one subject for today.
That's
and
funny.
It's a deep one too, and we'll see what kind of interaction we get today, and maybe it'll be a 50-minute live, maybe it'll be a 30-minute live, who knows? But here's something that I have been kind of ruminating on for a long time. It's a subject that bothers me a little bit, but I understand where it's coming from, and that is, and it's sort of a little bit of a taboo subject, but I think that we can address it in a very very honest and very upfront way, and that is that FICO ultimately is sort of indifferent. It doesn't care really who you are. It doesn't care what religion, what race, your income, your creed. It doesn't really matter. But yet you and I especially hear the whole credit industry getting attacked for underserved communities, or groups of people whose credit scores are not where they believe they should be. And the target oftentimes is, well, it's got to be the scoring system. It's got to be the bureaus. Let's revise that. Let's take a deeper look into that. As opposed to, well, maybe it's spending habits. Maybe it's the way you handle credit. Maybe it's a lack of knowledge. As though this, like I've said many times before, people don't really need you and me to explain credit to them. I mean, I like to think it's a more entertaining forum, but a lot of this stuff you can go to FICO.com. In fact, you quote it all the time. I can't tell you how many times I've heard you say, "Hey, if you don't believe me, go to FICO.com. They talk about this stuff." So what I'd like to talk about today is how and why can we present the how and why FICO is indifferent to all the things that people seem to think is important, as far as class, race, religion, anything like that. And then talk about what is FICO really trying to do? What are the bureaus really trying to do? What's their goal?
Sure. And I appreciate you bringing up the lightning rod topic. I think you may have seen the article today or about the CFPB's massive fine against a company, I think, that served either the Baltimore or Philadelphia, or Baltimore or either Maryland or Pennsylvania. I don't remember which state, but they were doing something called redlining. And what redlining is in lending is if you take a map of the United States and you kind of metaphorically draw a red line around certain areas of the country, and you say, I don't want to do lending in that area. So that's illegal. That's called redlining. You're not allowed to do that. You can avoid, the West Coast. You can avoid the East Coast. But you can't avoid a zip code in Pennsylvania. You can't do that. It's called redlining, and so that's what they got. That's what they got in trouble for. So then the question is who? I actually just did a really extensive interview about this and I don't want to spoil the lady's or steal her thunder. I'll let the story, I'll point it out when the story is published, but it's an issue of, who are you angry at, right? And if you look at credit, right, and consumer finance in general, and I want people to listen to this. This isn't just me talking for the next 30 minutes about this. I want you to look at kind of the long stream that makes up consumer finance, right? At the very end of the stream, you have credit scoring, because that's the last thing that a lender sees when you apply for credit, is they see your credit score, which is part of a credit report. So that is what I call the downstream, or the tip of the sword, right? And if you ask consumer advocates and the National Consumer Law Center, and to some extent, well, not to some extent, to a large extent, the CFPB, they really dislike the tip of the sword. They don't really have a lot of good things to say about credit scoring systems. They certainly don't have a lot of good things to say about credit bureaus. But the question is if you're willing to sit there for a minute and not be angry and dive deeper into this issue, which we can do because we have 50 minutes, which you can't do on television because your segment is a 4-minute block and you can't get a lot done in 4 minutes, is what are you really angry about, right? So you have this, we talked about this a few months ago, David, about this whole issue of the CFPB kind of taking over the credit reporting function and creating a public credit bureau. And essentially, and you may recall during our conversation, I moderated a panel where the people who were really proactively pushing this to the Biden campaign were presenting, and the CDIA, which is obviously very much against it, was also on the panel. And so I was trying to kind of facilitate the tennis match back and forth between those parties. And one of my questions was, all right, well, which of the credit bureaus are you going to leave standing? I understand you want to take one of them over, and the lady was like, no. We want to get rid of all of them. We want to completely just do away with that. The companies known as Equifax, Experian, TransUnion, and FICO, because they kind of wanted to take over the credit scoring function as well. And I was like, oh my God. So you're basically saying you want to eliminate 3 publicly traded companies in the US, 1 publicly traded company in the UK, which is Experian. Yep. You're going to eliminate God knows how many jobs for companies that are based in states that helped Biden get elected. California, Illinois, and Georgia were all blue. So anyway, that's not what we're talking about. The question is which of those parts of the stream are you really angry at? So you hear a lot of people accuse the credit bureaus and credit scoring systems of being discriminatory, all right? So and they don't use the term overt discrimination. So there's nothing in the credit scoring system that awards you more points for being Asian, or awards you more points for being white, or awards you fewer points because, like me, you're Hispanic, or awards you fewer points because you're African American, or avoids you fewer points because your gender identity is this versus that, or you're college educated versus not, or you live in this zip code versus you don't. There's nothing in any credit scoring system that has any of those variables where you're penalized or rewarded for any of those things. So there is no overt discrimination in credit scoring systems. It simply doesn't exist. So the term that you hear thrown around a lot is disparate impact. Is there kind of this unintentional discrimination against protected classes? Not overt, but unintended. So that's what you hear a lot about credit scoring systems. And if you look at the research suggests, and it's not funny, but it's actually kind of interesting that the Hispanics and African Americans have lower average credit scores than Caucasians, but Asians actually have the highest average credit scores. And so if you look at kind of the demographics, then it's Asians, Caucasian, Hispanic, African American. So then the question is well, okay, well, we have to throw away the credit scoring systems because that's the problem. Well, I don't know. Is that really the problem? Credit scores are based entirely and exclusively off information on a credit report. Okay, so now let's go upstream one pebble. Let's go one pebble upstream to the so now we're talking about credit reporting agencies because that's where the credit scoring systems are. They're basing their information off that data. Well, come on, you've looked at how many thousands of credit reports over your time, and everyone who's watching us, you've probably seen your own credit reports. You're probably interested in credit reports, or why the heck are you watching us?
Right.
there's nothing on your credit report that indicates your, your political affiliation, your level of education, your race. There's no race field, John Ulzheimer, Hispanic, David Michalek, white dude. There's nothing on there that's not there. So again, it's not overt. Now people are going to argue, well, the information on the credit report is there because of, systemic discrimination. Okay, fine. Then we're another pebble up the stream because we've already agreed that there's nothing in the credit scores that is overtly discriminatory. There's nothing in credit reports that is overtly discriminatory. You can have a credit report regardless of any of those. You could be a felon and have a credit report. So there's nothing that the credit reporting system does to kind of freeze people out of the credit environment. So if you're saying, if what you're really saying is well, we were, certain groups of consumers are not allowed to participate in the lending environment, and therefore they don't have the same types of credit reports that perhaps other people do, and therefore they don't have the same quality of credit score. That's a plausible argument. And you know what? That's actually a much better argument than blaming everything on the credit score and blaming everything on the credit report. I agree. I think there is some truth to that. I'm not a scientist and I haven't studied that issue. That's not what I do. But that article that came out today is a upstream problem, right? It identifies an upstream problem about lenders that are avoiding certain communities of color on purpose, not accidentally, on purpose. That's what redlining is. And therefore, those consumers who lived in that area could not have the same type of access to consumer finance, and therefore maybe they couldn't buy homes, which is a great way to build wealth and to live in safer communities and better school districts. So you can kind of see how there is there's connectivity between that and the information that ends up on a credit report, and therefore the information that goes into a score. So I'm not saying that the system is perfect. I'm just saying if you're going to blame somebody, spend a little bit of time to focus your blame on where the problem actually is. Because if you just say, you know what, the CFPB should take over credit reporting, well, that wouldn't have solved what happened in the announcement today. And that may not solve what's going to happen in the announcement in a year or in 2 years. All you're doing is you're putting a lot of people out of work, and B, you may not have solved the root problem. And certainly if you take over credit scoring, you didn't solve the root problem, you just took over credit scoring. So that's the only thing as I caution people is, I'm not saying you shouldn't be angry, you should be angry. But if you're going to be angry and you're going to be vocal about it, at least be angry at perhaps the right party along the stream of consumer finance. Because it's like, you know what, I'll give you a great example of what I think is a knee-jerk reaction. So we all know, we talked about this in March and April, or maybe May, we all talked about ad nauseum how the credit reporting industry was going to agree to take medical collections that had a zero balance off of credit reports as of July, which is done. July 1st was 27 days ago. And sometime next year, they're going to prevent new medical collections from hitting credit reports if they're under $500. Then the medical collection agency has to wait at least 12 months. So the credit reporting industry got to deal with that problem. Isn't it a problem really because the insurance claim process is horribly inefficient, impossible to understand, and even more difficult to maneuver within it? They didn't solve that problem. That's really the root problem. All they did was, you're still going to end up with medical collections. You're still going to end up with bills that you don't understand. That stuff isn't going to go away. It's just not going to show up on a credit report. You may still get sued because of it. So that's the example I just want to share, is that I'm not saying people shouldn't be angry about these issues. I'm saying I support you in your anger. I'm just saying focus your anger in the right place, or you're not going to solve the problem. I would really be upset if we ever ended up someday with a system that just kind of arbitrarily gave everybody a good credit score because it made everyone happy. Because then really credit scores are entirely worthless, and lenders aren't idiots, and they're going to try to figure out some other tool to use. So I think we should be careful about that.
Yeah, it's almost like we're turning the credit scoring somehow into
a game.
Well,
We're
that
turning it.
and
We're turning it into a game. How can we whittle down the information on a credit report so much that we make everyone happy because now they have good credit scores, they can get loans.
yeah, everybody gets to go home with a trophy.
Everyone gets to go home with a trophy, but in this case, it's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, which is a little bit different than a little plastic trophy for coming in ninth place in the race,
Right.
which that happened a lot to me because I'm very slow. So I just want to be make people very cognizant that you're focusing your anger perhaps at the wrong people.
Yeah, and that's one of the like I didn't start hearing this conversation. Like I've been in the repair / consulting education space for in a couple of months it'll be 10 years, and I never really heard that for the first 6 or 7 years. It was just more like I think people had a more personal appraisal of their credit score and how they got there. I don't think there was really a lot of questions like, yeah, I had this debt, I got this debt, I was young, I didn't pay it, I was divorced, whatever the story is. But it seems like the last 3-4 years, it's more like, well, yeah, but whose fault is it? Like, yeah, I'm here, but, maybe I should blame this person over here or this institution over here or this person. So it just seems like just the culturally the country has more of a blame game now than it ever has before. I'm not sure if that's if I'm expressing myself 100% what I'm thinking, but it seems like now I'm hearing more of, well, it shouldn't be this way. Well, my scores should be higher. Okay, well, what's that based off of? Well, because I feel like they should. And so that's kind of, for me, it's a little bit of a disturbing position for a lot of people in this space to start taking. Is like, well, yeah, it's really not my fault, or it shouldn't be affecting me as much as it is. Yeah. And I think that's why I wanted to talk more about, like, well, okay, well, what is FICO supposed to be doing here? And when I should also include Vantage Score as well, because they play a significant role in the scoring of people's credit reports.
So let's talk a little bit about that. All right. So I think a lot of people are kind of confused about what FICO's scoring systems and what Vantage Score's credit scoring systems and every other credit scoring system that's used in the United States, because they all have to comply with FCRA and ECOA. So in order for, I think sometimes people try to almost humanize credit scoring models, like, oh my gosh, they saw an inquiry, therefore they must think I'm doing something and therefore punishing me. Or, wow, they saw a large balance on my credit card, therefore they must think I'm doing something. And that's not what happens, okay? So in order to use a credit scoring system in the United States, there are actually 3 requirements. One, there are actually probably more than that, but the 3 that are most commonly discussed, which is meaning that the ones that I talk about a lot, no one else talks about this stuff, is number 1, it has to be empirically derived, meaning it has to be built using sound statistical techniques, which means that it can't just be a couple of boneheads sitting around a bar eating nachos and just kind of writing stuff down on beverage napkins saying, I think this should count, and I think it should count for 50 points. You can't do that. That's not an empirical process to build a credit score. So that's number 1. And this is all again, if you don't believe me, don't. Go to the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. You can find the language in there. So number 1, it has to be empirical.
And on that point, John, just as an example to give some context, FICO's been doing this since 1956 as far as gathering data and analyzing data. Vantage Score since 2006?
Correct.
Yeah, okay. So this isn't new stuff. These models and this way of
That's
crunching
right.
data has been around for a long time.
So number 1, it has to be empirically derived, right? Number 2 is it has to be demonstrably sound, which is a complicated way of saying you have to be able to prove that it works, right? You have to demonstrate that it is sound, demonstrably sound. And how do you do that? Well, you have to, number 1 is you can rely upon the credit scoring company, the developer, to provide what are called validation summaries. It's almost like the performance statistics of a car, 0 to 60 in this many seconds, 0 to 100 in that many seconds, this many miles per gallon, or if it's electric, this many miles per charge. So it's basically kind of like a statistics summary of the model. And so the credit scoring companies definitely provide those, and lenders can actually perform the validations themselves to demonstrate that the models work. And so if you've complied with those two things, then the model is ECOA compliant. The third requirement is actually from the Fair Credit Reporting Act, not the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. The third is you have to, as a lender, you have to give applicants that you've denied a notice of adverse action, and which is in English is called a denial letter. And that denial letter has to include a high-level overview of why you were denied. And so you can't just tell someone, oh, you were denied because your credit score is 680. That's not good enough. You have to explain, well, since 2011, you've had to give the score, but you've always had to explain kind of at a high level why your score wasn't better. And those are the adverse action codes or the score factors that you see along with FICO and Vantage scores, credit scores. And so they help lenders to comply with their FCRA requirement to provide adverse action, notices of adverse action. So if your score does all those things, then it's compliant and it's legal to be used in the United States. The scoring systems could care less about the backstory of the information on your credit report. They don't care. They don't care that you lost your job. They don't care that you just won the lottery. They don't care that you're a doctor. They don't care that you're a professional athlete. They don't care that you work at McDonald's. They don't care about that stuff. They can't care about that, right? So it is and it's not even a black box. I would say at worst, it's opaque. But I mean, FICO's been telling people what's inside their models for 3 decades, right? It's just that people may not choose to listen, but they've been very open about what's in their models for a very long time. And so the single use or the single purpose of a credit score is to rank people based on their level of risk, right? It's called rank ordering. So if you take 100 people and you score all 100 of those people and all their scores fall between whatever, 500 and 800, it's very easy to put them in order based on their score, and you've just ranked those people based on their level of risk. That is the only job a credit score has. Now it's up to the lender to say, well, where do I want to draw the line and say approve everybody above this number and deny everybody below that number? That's called a rate tier or a risk tier. And if you're above the risk, if you're an acceptable level of risk, you're going to get approved. If you're not an acceptable level of risk, then you either may get denied or adversely approved. So approved, but with less advantageous terms. That is the only purpose that a credit score has. If you, that's the stated design objective, to predict the likelihood of somebody going 90 days or worse in the next 24 months. And then you have the score, and then it's very easy for the lender to say, no to these people, yes to those people.
Right. Yeah. So the takeaway here for everybody that's watching is that FICO and Vantage score are completely indifferent to who you are. They just want to know what you've been doing. And I've always, ever since I learned, probably from you, John, years ago, what the credit score actually means and what it's designed to do, it makes 100% sense. I mean, if you're taking a tremendous amount of financial data that's on a credit report that's been accumulating for some people like you and me, you a lot longer because you got a thicker credit file than I have. But even for me, for going back 10 plus years, that's a tremendous amount of information that has to be in some way organized and understood to give some kind of predictive analysis. What is the likelihood of my ability to make good on a promise, make good on a debt? Yeah. And that's really all that it is. I think it's a brilliant model. And if we're asking banks and credit unions and lenders of all sort to make lending easy for us and simple and instantaneous, which it used to not be. I mean, how long would an underwriting process last 50 years ago, 60 years, before FICO, before the desktop underwriting, before this automated stuff? Now you can apply for a credit card. You can apply for I did my home loan some time back. I had a response back in, I think the lender had it back in 30 minutes or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's only because he had to put some additional information in there. But for like a credit card, it's instantaneous. So I think sometimes people forget it, the convenience that we have in this day and age because we have this kind of technology.
Here's the question that and again, no one in any position of authority has been willing to engage with me on this. You have what I call kind of drive-by opinions, right? They're driving by, they roll down the window, they'll scream their opinion at you, then they'll roll the window up and keep driving, right? It's a drive-by opinion. The scoring system is unfair. Credit bureaus are terrible. And, there should be a public option and not three different, private companies. We should take over. Fine, I get it. I've heard the arguments. If they would slow down the car and at least let me ask a question, my question would always be, what is your suggestion? I'm all ears, right? What is your suggestion to change credit scoring so that it's still compliant with ECOA and FCRA, but is to your liking, right? So what is your that? And no one has ever been willing to give, other than stuff like, well, just make it better. That's not an answer, right? You're dodging my question. What would you do? I understand you're critical. I understand you're angry. I understand you don't like the system. Just give me something. Tell me 3 things you would do to change it to make it better, right? So, and then the same question about credit reporting. I get it. You don't like the credit bureaus, which is weird because most people who have good credit don't really have a problem with the credit bureaus. It's usually the people who have bad credit who have the problems with the credit bureaus. So number one, I have a question about the authenticity of your anger, right? Because how many people use Credit Versio who have FICO 840? I don't know, probably not many, but maybe there are some. But okay, but it's not like the overwhelming percentage of the folks who use your system, right?
Most are in the 5s.
Okay, so that makes sense. That makes sense to me because you have a lot of upward mobility with your credit score. So I understand, but I also understand people are unhappy about the credit reporting system, and I get it. Okay, it might feel like an invasion of privacy. You didn't really sign anything, or you actually probably did, but you don't remember signing something giving all these companies permission to share this information with these companies that you probably have never heard of until you went to go pull a credit report. Then the question is, well, how would you change the system? What would you do to change the system and make it better? I'm all ears, and I haven't gotten a good answer to that one either. So I'm a little befuddled that I can't seem to get better answers other than just drive-by angry opinions and statements about scoring and reporting.
Yeah. So Todd says, thank you for the information. Christopher thinks that this is a bunch of babbling. So it kind of goes.
They're listening to the same thing. So here's the one so thank you, Todd. So Christopher, that's a drive-by opinion. How should we make this better? That's
exactly what we're talking about.
How should we make this better? Because I'm not going to tell you how to get stuff deleted because we don't do that when I'm on. That's David's thing. We're happy to, and this is David's show. You're going to have to give him suggestions on other stuff to talk about.
Let's see. Let's see what Gregory has to say. It would be better if the credit bureau would double check and make sure that the companies are actually doing their research instead of saying it came back verified. Okay, I can live with that one. That's a good one. What do you think? So John,
that's a reasonable suggestion, right?
Having worked inside Equifax in dispute resolution, how would you respond to Gregory's comment there?
Yeah, no, that's a reasonable suggestion. I would suggest back that the FCRA is going to have to be modified and remove the 30-day limit because the number of disputes that the credit bureaus receive, I think the last time the CFPB counted was like over 8 million a year. Really what you're suggesting, Greg, and this is not a criticism, I'm just kind of thinking through your suggestion, is you're really suggesting multiple investigations of the same thing, right? Because if the credit bureaus are double checking something that's already been verified, you're really asking for at least two verifications. So I think you'd have to remove the 30-day limit for investigations. Another thing that I hear this a lot, especially in lawsuits where someone is suing a credit bureau, is they've accused the credit bureau of not really conducting an investigation, right? And so that the question the issue that always comes up is, well, do you want Equifax to be the arbiter between you and Bank of America? So if you're arguing with Bank of America about whether or not something was late or whether or not the balance is correct, do you really want Equifax to be kind of like the referee in the middle of you two and arbitrate between you and the bank? I don't know. Because that's kind of the double check, right? Is you get something back from the lender, you may not agree with it. Well, now you want the credit bureau or maybe 3 credit bureaus to go back and perform something invasive with the lender. So I get it. I just think that you'd have to remove the 30-day. You have to become way more patient with your disputes.
I think some of that too comes from, and Gregory, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's been my experience over the last decade or so that when people send off their disputes, whether they're doing it online through Credit Versio or themselves or whatever, I think sometimes they when they get that response back in a week or 2 weeks and it says, no, everything's all kosher, everything is as it should be. It's like, well, how did you come to that conclusion? I think people get the feeling that they got the blow off, that maybe something wasn't done. Maybe if maybe if there was more of a description or some kind of an outline of, okay, this is what we did. We send it off to the data furnisher, and here's what the data furnisher said they did. Well, we received your dispute, and we went into the files, and we had such and such person in customer service look at it. We checked out the statements, and some kind of an explanation as to, okay, how did we come to this conclusion? Because otherwise, it almost feels like, it's like, hey, we got your dispute. Go away, kid, you bother me. That kind of a response. Now, sometimes people, their disputes are remedied. Depends on what it is and what they're disputing and how legitimate it is. And then sometimes it comes back and like they don't really understand what was done, if anything at all. And John, you and I both know this is like, if something is not clear in an industry where things are very opaque, as you said earlier, people tend to assume the worst. Like, they're yanking my chain. They're not really doing what they're supposed to be doing. Yeah. So Gregory says, more or less for them to provide proof, as they should, that the credit is mine, versus just verified. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Looks like we're on point.
It does sound like we are, and so if you look at what the credit bureaus do versus what the actual furnisher does, is they do something very different, but they're both called investigations, right? The consumer files a dispute, and if you listen to any FCRA plaintiff's attorney, they will always advise their customers to file a dispute with the credit bureaus. They want that process to occur. It's called a reinvestigation. I don't know why it's called but that's what it's called. It's called a reinvestigation in the FCRA for some odd reason. So the credit reporting agencies are essentially almost acting on behalf of the consumer, in as much as they're just simply going to the furnisher and saying, hey, Greg filed a dispute with us. This is what he's disputing. And here is the document that he sent to us, because it's now an attachment. It's a file that's attached. Think of how a file is attached to an email. The file is attached to the dispute form, and that package of information is then sent out to the furnisher. So they're instigating the process. Now the furnisher, depending on what type of dispute it is, they're the ones who actually do the heavy lifting, right? If it's a fraud investigation, then it goes usually to a specially trained unit of people who are tasked with dealing with allegations of either fraudulent charges or true name fraud of the account. If it's something more simple, like the balance is wrong, or hey, I wasn't late this month, or hey, this isn't my account, you must have me confused with somebody else, then that's usually something that's done with a different group of dispute analysts or dispute processors. They all go through a process. It's very unusual that you run into a furnisher that can't articulate what their procedures are. And the reason that they all have procedures is because they're required to. The FCRA requires that they have procedures in place to perform reasonable investigations. If you have no procedures at all, it's kind of hard to argue that your procedures are reasonable because you don't have any, right? So they all have procedures. I think what would be helpful is sometimes if the furnishers would publish these are our procedures. If you dispute the balance, these are the 5 things we do. If you dispute the late payments, these are the 6 things we do. If you say this was caused by fraud, these are the 9 things that we do, and the 8 things that we look for as far as indicia of liability, which happens a lot. So if you're going to allege fraud, you better be right, because there's a lot of ways they can figure out if you're full of it or not. It's actually pretty impressive what they can see. So yeah, I wouldn't have a problem with doing something like that. Or I don't know if it's a requirement or something that perhaps the credit bureaus ask their 14,000 furnishers to do, but I think that would be a reasonable request.
And just imagining that would happen. That would largely come from the CDIA, wouldn't it? Would that be in the credit reporting resource guide, or is that something entirely separate?
Yeah, so the Credit Reporting Resource Guide, or the CRRG, is not the manual that guides investigations. So there's nothing in the it's called the Metro 2 manual. There's nothing in the Metro 2 manual that explains how to fill out ACDVs or how to use eOscar or what the 5 things you have to do when responding to a consumer's dispute. The Metro 2 manual is designed for the ongoing and organic monthly furnishing of information, not the one-off dispute responses. So no, there's nothing in the manual that addresses investigations, and that's not what the manual is designed for. It's not like it's delinquent on that issue. That's just not what it's designed for. It's the CDIA can't force furnishers to do anything, include to report anything at all to the reporting agencies. What they can do is they can only mandate that they use a certain format and a certain series of codes, which is Metro 2. But as far as publishing their policies with respect to investigations, I'm not sure they could force companies to do that.
Louis says, hello, gentlemen. And Gregory, so I think this is something good to bring up. What about when I ask about not my account and I ask for proof of signature? Usually that's almost enough just to kind of stop right there. And John, we discussed this before about what you can ask for the sun and the moon and the stars, but there isn't a reasonable expectation that something like that is going to be in possession of the bureaus, and sometimes maybe not even the creditor. So I don't know if this is some kind of a tactic that's done. I think maybe in the credit repair space where it's like, well, if they don't provide you proof of your signature, somehow it's not yours. But they have other ways of determining if something is yours. Like, John, one of the arguments that I got in one time with a client is, well, they never provided me proof. They never provided me proof that was my credit card. Actually, I remember this conversation pretty clearly. It was years ago. And I said, well, they know it's yours. And he says, well, how do they know it's mine? I said, because you paid it for 4.5 years. And then suddenly you didn't pay it and went into a charge off. I don't think there's very much of an argument here.
Yeah, no, look, lenders are not dumb, right? And they get an enormous amount of disputes regarding fraudulent charges and fraudulent accounts. And there is an amazing number of sophisticated ways for them to connect you with transactions. All right. And I'm not talking about video at Target of you buying something using their credit card. I'm not talking about that kind of hokiness. I'm talking about, metadata and from sources that you would never even believe where it comes. There's companies that provide this type of information that sell these types of services to lenders. And so I think what the argument is that's called indicia of liability, right? And it's essentially looking for breadcrumbs that connect you with the credit card. And one of the indicia of liability is the longevity of usage, right? So if you had an account for 5 years and now all of a sudden you're claiming fraud, there is indicia of liability, not indicia of fraud. If there are patterns in shopping that models will evaluate, and if it's within your pattern of shopping, but you say all of a sudden it's not yours, again, there's indicia of liability. It's almost like when you use a credit card, or you get a phone call from your credit card issuer and they say, hey, did you just buy $1,000 of dog food in Delaware? And you're like, whoa, that's not me. Well, that's indicia of fraud, right? Or it's an atypical transaction, and their fraud models have picked up on it, and they want to make sure that it's really you buying all that dog food in a state where you've never visited. So it's not as simple as just, oh, they didn't have a signature, therefore they can't prove that it's mine. It's not about the signature. When was the last time you put a wet signature on anything, right? You don't use a wet signature when you go to the shopping store. You don't use it at the gas station. You don't use it at the grocery store. You're signing a pad. You're not putting an actual wet signature on anything. The only time people put wet signatures on things is if they're buying a home and they're at the closing table, or they're buying a car and they're sitting there with the F&I manager. But otherwise, you're really not putting wet signatures on things any longer. You're clicking boxes and agreeing to things, and that's about the extent of it. And I don't know that most banks are required to keep the signature cards. If you do open an account with a wet signature, they don't keep that stuff, in perpetuity. That stuff is purged after a period of time. So it's not just about whether or not they can show your signature on something.
Excellent. Okay, Patricia Pissarro, excuse me, I fumbled that one a little bit. What about collection agency has claimed a card is yours, and then this card was never on your credit report? What can you request from them? These cards are from 5-6 years ago. So, Patricia, are you saying that this isn't your stuff? That this isn't your card? Is that what we're asking?
Yeah, so a collection agency isn't your creditor, right? They're not your credit card issuer. So they are relying upon their client, which is the credit card issuer. And it's really the client that is indicating to them that the credit card is yours. And so they're giving them all the documentation and backup paperwork. And there's actually an agreement, there's a consignment agreement between debt collectors and original creditors, where the debt collector asks the original creditor to affirm that the assignment of debts are actually they're valid debts. So they're not just consigning stuff that's either discharged in bankruptcy, was caused by fraud, or is knowingly incorrect. The debt collector will, if you do ask them to validate the debt, I think you have one crack at that apple, right? And if you ask them to validate it and they're unable to do so, then obviously they're supposed to stop the presses. But if they can validate it, or if they feel reasonably certain that it is yours, then of course they're going to continue to try to collect it. And there's no requirement that they report it to a credit reporting agency. Even the original creditor isn't required to report it to a credit reporting agency. So I wouldn't correlate that as meaning anything other than perhaps they just chose to not report it. And I'm not saying that this is your scenario, Patricia, but hypothetically, if it was a business credit card that you were personally liable for, it's very likely that it never showed up on your credit report until it went into default. So there's a whole lot of moving parts with respect to that issue of when it's reported. If you have collections on your credit reports for credit cards that you know are not yours, they were never yours, you have no idea what they are. Now, I'm not talking about, well, they're my ex-husband's and we got divorced and he's supposed to pay him. I'm not talking about that kind of stuff. I'm talking about legitimate and authentic. There is no relationship between you in any form or fashion with those credit cards. You were either a victim of fraud, or there is just some screw up with your name and you're being associated with these things somehow. Then and you make a good faith effort to get that stuff removed from your credit reports, and no one is helping you, reach out to David and I will give him the names of 2 or 3 flesh-eating FCRA attorneys that would love to hear from someone like you who has that type of scenario. But they're going to sniff out bullshit quicker than I will. So I'm just telling you, please make sure that your story is as authentic as it possibly can be. And if it is, then and you've made efforts to get that stuff deleted and you can't, you've got some pretty good cases there.
Yeah. And always too, if it's everything produces on the up and up, remember that the attorneys don't charge you anything, so they take everything pro bono, and whatever costs are going to be paid by the parties that are involved in this
at the settlement, because these all settle. They all settle. Well, most of
Yep.
them settle. The overwhelming majority of them settle.
Yeah, great. Yeah, Patricia, just send me an email at davidm@creditversio.com, and I'll be more than happy to reach out to John, and we'll get it taken care of for you. Okay, where are we?
And also, and let David know what state you live in, because the name I give you is going to be based largely on where you live.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Okay, so looks like we're coming down to the end of it, John. That was a really good Q&A.
Yep.
We're almost at the close enough 45-minute mark. That's about right. It's about how long that we go. All right. So, any last questions before John and I drop off here?
I'm trying to think if there's any like hot news that
I was
dropped in the
thinking
last
about that
two.
today. Yeah, I was thinking
Yeah.
about today. I was even going through the collection and data. I forgot the website that I follow. But normally there's some hot stuff in there, but I haven't seen anything the last couple of days.
Just a lot of
Oh,
announcements from the CFPB fining a lot of companies for doing, like Hyundai got nailed yesterday, and today was that company. I don't remember the name of the company, and I think it was Philadelphia that they were redlining.
they're suing TransUnion again, from what I
Oh,
read.
okay.
Yeah, so I don't know what's going on there. Um, oh yeah, Patricia. Yeah. I'll respond to this comment on Facebook, and I'll put my email address in there for you. Okay, Gregory. Thanks for all the information. All right. Yeah, well, we try to help as much as we can. We're probably not going to make everybody happy, especially the what was it, John? You called it the drive-by
The,
question, or
the drive-by opinions,
the
you
drive-by
know.
opinions? Okay.
But I
Hey,
use that in my expert reports. I get a lot of I write a lot of rebuttal reports, and a lot of the experts on the plaintiff side, they'll read, and this is not an exact. They'll read thousands of documents, and we'll have one line in a 40-page expert report that says, oh, and because of all that, so and so was damaged, and then that's it. They won't give any sort of context or depth. And I'm like, wait a minute, what? That's a drive-by opinion, right?
they're trying to do an economic impact assessment with just one line.
Well, what they're trying to do is they're trying to write an expert report on a budget, and so they can't spend.
Oh,
They're not allowed to spend 30 hours reading
oh, gotcha.
documents and actually writing something of a quality opinion report. They're essentially just kind of using I think a template and just dropping in, so and so was damaged, but then you don't. So really, what that does is it puts the burden on me to do all the work and explain why it didn't happen. So I don't like those drive-by opinions, because they I don't know. To me, they seem less genuine.
Yeah, but it's probably an easy target for you.
Most of them are. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Everybody, thank you so much for joining me and John today. I appreciate it. John, thank you so much for great answers. Always,
Yes, sir.
Always appreciated. And we will see everybody next Wednesday. Take care.
All right. Bye, y'all.